Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival, Join the Conversation, and I'd like to welcome you from wherever you may be watching. Transforming the way that the festival is delivered, from live appearances to an online version, and offering an even stronger, more diverse and plentiful series of events, is a reflection of our belief that literature and the arts provide a catalyst for dialogue, creativity, empathy, laughter and tears, binding communities together. We're enormously grateful to all our speakers who've dedicated their time and talents to the festival. Please buy their books as a way of enhancing the festival experience. It's my pleasure to invite you, on behalf of my colleagues and board, as well as myself, to join the conversation. We hope that you'll do so in person next November, if at all possible. Charleston in South Carolina is a beautiful, historic and hospitable town, and the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival will definitely be going from strength to strength.
I'm Suzanne Pollack, Director of Development for the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. This year, more than ever, we are so grateful to our generous donors, returning and new, who've made it possible to offer free sessions to everyone everywhere, building a truly international audience. There's still time for you to become a donor. We're taking donations throughout the month of November. So if you would like to become a sponsor, and we urge you to do so, please contact me using my email on the website. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Leah Ryan, and I'm the Festival Director of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. Today, it is my honor to introduce you to two very special authors. Brit Bennett has been compared to Toni Morrison. Her work is as lyrical as her accomplishments are long. She's a graduate of Stanford University with an MFA from the University of Michigan. Her work has been featured in The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and the Paris Review. Both her novels, The Mothers and The Vanishing Half, are New York Times bestsellers. Sara Collins was a lawyer for 17 years before obtaining a master's degree in creative writing from Cambridge University. Her 2019 debut novel, The Confessions of Frannie Langton, is a gothic masterpiece and won the coveted Costa First Novel Award. Today, Brit and Sara will be discussing Brit's second novel, The Vanishing Half, in what might be one of our most timely festival conversations. While social unrest grips the world, Brit and Sara will dig into skin color, family, sisterhood, and what it means to leave behind your racial identity. It's poignant to me to introduce this session from 20 South Battery. Built in 1843, this Charleston, South Carolina mansion has stood watch over years of slavery, Reconstruction, segregation, and integration. It's endured war and hurricanes. Buildings have their own stories, their own identities, just like we do, just like Brit and Sara. Without further ado, here are Brit Bennett and Sara Collins.
Hello, it is such a pleasure to be virtually in South Carolina for the Charleston to Charleston Festival. I'm Sara Collins, and I am incredibly excited to speak today with Brit Bennett, who I think is nestled in her living room in Brooklyn. It is such a treat to be able to do this kind of thing, living room to living room, where we used to be doing it in town halls and tents. And hopefully next year we'll both be able to be in South Carolina. Brit, I've said it before to you, but I'm going to say it again. I want to start by asking you what it's like to live through the best of times and the worst of times, because it's been the best of times. You have had the publication of The Summer, the book that rescued me during the pandemic, The Vanishing Half. It's been a runaway bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. Instantly hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It's been optioned for television by HBO in the kind of deal that makes other authors clutch their chests and have panic attacks. I think it's a future prize winner, and it's certainly my book of the year. But of course, we've also been going through this pandemic. You've had to be absorbing all of this through strange virtual experiences like this one. So what has the experience been like?
I mean, the way that I've just described it to people is that this is the first time in my life that I've ever drank champagne alone. And I think that has felt like a weird metaphor for this moment of having these moments of celebration, but also experiencing them completely in isolation. So, you know, I think at the end of the day, I feel really fortunate just to have any type of good news during what has been such a horrible year. And I'm grateful that this book has had the reception that it's received.
Yes, what a reception. When you started to write at the precocious age of 17, your first novel, The Mothers, we'll come back to that. Did you picture this for yourself? You know, one of the authors of the year, the person who's changing the conversation or defining the conversation. Was that on your horizon?
No, never. No, I mean, I think that my ceiling then was just publishing a book, any book.
Yeah.
And that was the wild dream. So the idea that this book has been received in such a big way is something I did not imagine for myself this year, let alone when I was 17.
We have to talk about context, because one of the points people make is that the book has achieved success, not just because it's pretty much a masterpiece, but it's been published in a context where it connects with people. I'm going to use a word that I guarantee you're sick of hearing. It's described as timely. And I read a really interesting review of another book in the Washington Post recently, which said, a timely novel is only ever accidentally timely. Does that resonate with you? Do you feel like this book is timely, or is it that you're talking about, unfortunately, timeless issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I think that, you know, timeliness is something it's applied outside of the book and sort of independent from the book, almost in a way. I think timeliness has more to do with where the public is when a book comes out than anything about the book itself. So it's definitely surreal to hear the book described as that, particularly because it's a book set so far in the past. And it's a book that I started writing in, 4 or 5 years ago, not knowing the context in which it would be published. So it's definitely strange, but I am glad that people were in a place to receive it when the book came out.
So let's tell people what the book is about, and perhaps tempt you into giving us a reading just to set it up, this accidentally timely and hugely successful novel. Can you tell us what it's about?
Yeah, so The Vanishing Half is about Desiree and Stella, who are identical twin sisters, come from this town that prizes light skin, and they decide to live their lives in very different directions. One is a white woman and one is a black woman.
And the twin who goes off to live as a white woman is Stella, and the other twin who returns to their town and then lives her life as a black woman is Desiree. Could you give us a reading and kind of set it up for us before we talk about that town?
Sure. So I'm actually going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book that introduces the town to you and tells you a little bit about the town's history. It was a strange town. Mallard, named after the ring-necked ducks living in the rice fields and marshes. A town that, like any other, was more idea than place. The idea arrived to Alphonse de Sour in 1848 as he stood in the sugarcane fields he'd inherited from the father who'd once owned him. The father, now dead, the now freed son wished to build something on those acres of land that would last for centuries to come. A town for men like him, who would never be accepted as white but refused to be treated like Negroes. Third place. His mother, rest her soul, had hated his lightness. When he was a boy, she'd shoved him under the sun, begging him to darken. Maybe that's what made him first dream of the town. Lightness, like anything inherited at a great cost, was a lonely gift. He'd married a mulatto even lighter than himself. She was pregnant then with their first child, and he imagined his children's children's children, lighter still, like a cup of coffee steadily diluted with cream, a more perfect Negro, each generation lighter than the one before. Soon others came. Soon idea and place became inseparable, and Mallard carried throughout the rest of St. Landry Parish, Colored people whispered about it, wondered about it. White people couldn't believe it even existed. When St. Catherine's was built in 1938, the diocese sent over a young priest from Dublin who arrived certain that he was lost. Didn't the bishop tell him that Mallard was a colored town? Well, who are these people walking about? Fair and blonde and redheaded, the darkest ones no swarthier than a Greek. Was this who counted for colored in America, who whites wanted to keep separate? Well, how could they ever tell the difference? And I'll stop right there.
You take us back to your invented town, Mallard, in the late 60s. It's conjured up so vividly and so beautifully, where people are preoccupied with the question not only of race or color. And this is what I mean about context. It's published in America 2020, where the conversation is dominated by concerns about race and color. Where did this story of Mallard start for you? How did you come to that particular setting for the novel, and that setting which really was the spark for the idea?
Yeah, it started with a conversation with my mother, who is from rural Louisiana, and she was telling me about a town that she remembered hearing about as a child growing up there. And it was a town where people were just obsessed with color and obsessed with their children getting lighter from generation to generation. So that was really my entry point into the world, was thinking about this town, which sounded to me very fantastical and sort of mythological, and also very disturbing and very absurd.
Does it seem as if things are moving backwards? There was this idea that there had been a phenomenal amount of racial progress achieved in America, in particular with the election of Barack Obama. People started prematurely talking about a post-racial society. What's your take on the state of things now?
I don't know. I think a quote I keep thinking, I've read Michael Smith's new book, Stakes is High, and there's a quote in the book where he just says America always returns to itself, and that's something that I think of that kind of speaks to this moment of, even if you see the election of a Black president, that's sort of a deviation. That's not, that if you look at the history of America, there's nothing in that specific moment to give you confidence that we're heading in that direction uninterrupted. When in fact what you see is that pendulum kind of swinging back and forth all the time. So honestly, I don't know. I don't know what to make really of this moment. I think only time will tell.
Kind of reminds me of a Toni Morrison quote as well, which I'm going to butcher because I have to paraphrase it, but she said something about water having a very long memory and always returning to its starting point. Speaking of Toni Morrison, you've been compared to her, and justifiably so. And I think one of the sort of Morrisonian, if that's an adjective, threads I see is the way in which you conjure up this place, Mallard. It's rendered so vividly and so compellingly that I wanted to ask you about how you went about creating setting. It's a craft question, but one which I'm sure is fascinating for readers as well. How do you conjure up a place?
Thank you. I think in the case of this book, part of it was reading some nonfiction about these very small Creole towns that did exist, where people were very concerned about skin color, and also these just sort of insular communities and the way in which they exist specifically in Louisiana, and in a way that they don't exist, throughout lots of other parts of America. There's a very like specific racial context in Louisiana that I've always found really interesting. So some of it was drawing on those sources, but a lot of it was just writing towards the stories that my mother told me. There were lots of stories that I just grew up hearing about her growing up in Louisiana during segregation. And, she would talk about going to see movies and having to sit in the balcony with the other Black people and throwing popcorn at the white kids sitting underneath. And there are things like that were just such specific memories that she had that I wanted to find ways to integrate as I was thinking about what the experience would be like for these girls growing up in this town at that time.
And I think one of the characters in the novel, or maybe it's the sort of omniscient narrator, says Mallard was an idea more than a place. What does that mean to you? What could we take away from that?
Yeah, I think, like I said, my entry to this town was sort of through kind of rumor almost. It was not a place that my mother had even said that she had visited. It was the idea of this town she had heard of. So I always was thinking about the idea of this town in this kind of sort of abstract way and this kind of mythologized way more than writing into any specific history in that sense. So I wanted to think about the idea of this town being this really nebulous space, it being this town that when you're in it, it feels like there is no escaping it, and like you are sort of surrounded by these borders, and you're sectioned away from white people and you're sectioned away from the other Black people, and it feeling like that. But also this town that kind of disintegrates into the mist a little bit. And a town that once you leave it, it still follows you somehow. Even once you've left Mallard and you've gone through other parts of the country or the world, you can't really shake it from you. So I wanted to think about that town feeling realized and feeling concrete, but also feeling like something that was portable almost, that you could take it with you more than it is a place that you visit and stay.
And you interrogate the mythology of race as well. It brings to mind for me Nell Irvin Painter's line, "Race is an idea, not a fact." I want to talk about that in the context of your story, because it's not just the twins, the one white passing twin and the twin who embraces her Black identity. There's a large cast of characters surrounding them. So you have one of the twins' daughters who is very dark and is described when she returns to Mallard as blue-black, who has a really wonderful love affair. Her partner is a trans man. They are supported initially by a drag queen. We have the daughter of the white passing twin who has to struggle with her identity and where she fits. Is part of the project here, or one of the resonant themes, how we take comfort in identity, how it can become a kind of refuge?
I mean, I think so. I think that the characters in this book, and some that you described, I think there's some of them that are finding comfort in fashioning identities or transforming into these new identities, and some people who feel very oppressed and trapped by their identities and are desperate to escape them. And to me, I want to think about all the cast of characters surrounding these twins, to think of how people were navigating that differently. Somebody like Barry, who you described who's a drag queen, he's somebody who enjoys the sort of artfulness and the creativity and the play that comes with identity, that comes with performing, that comes with slipping into another identity briefly and slipping back into your other life. That's a very different journey than somebody like Reese or somebody like Stella or somebody like Kennedy, who go on these different sort of different relationships to their identities, some of which are very painful for some of these characters, and some of which are liberating, and also some of which are both of those things kind of mixed in together. So I wanted to think about that, the idea of becoming a new person, that it can be something that is painful and something that involves a lot of loss. It can also be something that's really liberating, and it can be both of those things at the same time.
Speaking of the loss, one of the things that really interested me is Stella often has this uncontrollable urge to, I suppose you would call it, confess. You know, when another Black woman moves into the neighborhood where she's living with Stella's living with her white husband and passing as white, she befriends this woman, but obviously in a dishonest way, which is the way in which she has to transact all of her relationships. And she often wants to say to her, you know, I'm like you. There's a sense in which she loses more than she gains by passing. And that was refreshing, because usually we think of the advantages of passing as white. Your book interrogates what she loses by separating herself from her community. What does she lose?
Yeah, I mean, I think she loses a lot. You know, I think she obviously is gaining, you know, wealth and security and power. She gains this husband and this child and this sort of new world that she's able to enter. But to me, I was really interested in that question of what people lose. And to me, the saddest thing is losing your community, losing your family, losing your sense of history. This idea that even when she narrates the story of her life, she always has to kind of cut her sister out of it. or she has to tell the story of her life in this way that's really incomplete. So I wanted to think about that. And when she has this Black woman move into her neighborhood, I wanted that to be a really shocking moment for Stella, because not only is she afraid that this Black woman is going to sort of suss out her secret and expose her, but I think there's also this moment of her realizing that she could have remained Black and married a rich Black man in the way that Loretta did and end up in that same neighborhood and end up with some of those same material things that she has. She sees somebody who has lived her life in some ways similarly, in that she's married well, but without sort of discarding her past, without discarding her family or her friends. And she sees this woman who's kind of this alternate version of what her life could be like, where she has girlfriends who come over and gossip and play cards, or she has her, mother comes to visit for the holidays, or she has those type of personal relationships that she's lost. And I think, as you said, she's sort of doomed herself in a way to live all of her relationships in this way that, if not dishonest, is just incomplete. And I think that's, to me, that's something that I would imagine would be one of the hardest things about living as Stella.
There's an ease of understanding as well, of having yourself understood that in my reading of the novel, she loses. Which brings me to another question I had for you, because I smiled the whole way through this novel, because it's a novel that will resonate with communities who have lived these experiences in a way that I just don't think it can with outsiders. And yet it is being gobbled up by people who haven't had these experiences. The highest compliment that I can pay any writer is the Toni Morrison compliment. And I think the other link, the other connection I see between your work and hers is exemplified in something she said when she was interviewed, that she does not write for Black people, but to and through Black people. It's the way I read your novel. Is that a reading you'd agree with? Is that something you think about, and is that your intention when writing?
I mean, definitely. I think that not only reading Toni Morrison's work, but also seeing the ways in which she talked about her work is something that has always been really influential to me. This idea that I don't have to capitulate to a white gaze. I don't have to translate myself. I don't have to have an imagined reader who's different than myself or my community or the characters that I write about. I think about how she talks about, I reread Sula over the summer, and in the introduction, she talked about the idea of the lobby in a novel. And like, the lobby is where you have to welcome the reader in and to kind of situate them for the story that's about to be told. And then the book starts. And she talks about like not wanting to have that lobby in her book. And obviously the lobby is for that presumed outsider reader that you're describing, who you have to welcome in to make sure that they get comfortable before you welcome them into this world that they're about to enter. And I just loved what she was saying in that introduction about getting rid of the lobby, just starting the story where you want to start it, and whether that person is able to understand or anything, that's on the reader. It's not on you as the writer. So it's something that certainly I think has been so formative for me. And I feel very fortunate that this was a writer I grew up reading, who that was where she was positioned as a writer. That was sort of my starting point as a writer, is that I think a lot of that I take for granted. That, yeah, I don't have to write to an imagined white reader. I don't have to translate and explain. I can write to and with and for and toward my community. And that's a valid and also more interesting way to write. It's more interesting than having to feel like you have to translate and explain and teach. I'm not interested in doing any of that. And I'm really glad that I had so many writers to read as a young person who showed me that path forward.
Any others? I know I'm glad to hear that you don't mind the Toni Morrison comparisons. Were there any other influences?
I mean, who could mind that comparison? It's obviously
well,
unbelievably flattering.
You don't know. No, it's really, I think, the highest compliment a writer could be.
It is. Yeah, I mean, I think people like Zora Neale Hurston.
Who are the runner-up? Who are the runners-up?
Yeah, I mean, I think writers like Zora Neale Hurston as a writer, and I think, the way in which I thought about beginning this book was the way that Their Eyes Were Watching God begins, which is, you know, a woman has mysteriously returned from elsewhere. So that was something that I really wanted to do with this book of Desiree just appearing in the beginning of the book from a mysterious elsewhere. So that's a book that I love. I think somebody like James Baldwin, who was really instructive to me as a novelist and as an essayist. And I think even, you know, I think someone like Alice Walker, to me, the sort of holy trinity when I was, you know, growing up in the 90s was Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, and Terry McMillan. And I think there's a lot of ways in which Terry McMillan has really sort of influenced me about writing about like Black women who are unlikable and who are difficult and who want a lot of things. That I think all of those writers, I think growing up seeing those, particularly those Black women writers on Oprah and on television and on the bestsellers list, like they really paved the way that you could write books that are critically acclaimed and are selling and become movies, and you could be on Oprah, you know, all of those writers. I think I saw that in a way just growing up that I'm really glad that was sort of the time in which I was growing up and looking to those Black women writers in particular.
I was smiling so hard throughout that because I'm just slightly older than you, but I also worship the same Holy Trinity and, you know, sort of reenacted the waiting to exhale moment with my friend. And the way, as you say, in which each of those writers were able to achieve this thing that Toni Morrison said about writing themselves and their communities without explanation and catching on universally. It was so instrumental.
Definitely.
The other thing I want to ask you about, coming back to this idea about writing communities, is a comment that was made to you in an interview I listened to. The interviewer was not a person of color, and they referred to your debut novel, The Mothers, with an adjective which stuck in my mind. I think they described it as subversive because you had depicted middle-class Black people doing ordinary things. And, you know, I felt quite taken aback, I'm going to say, offended by that, because what's subversive about middle-class Black people? What's your take on that? And also, you made a deliberate shift then. You're tackling race much more directly in this second novel than you did in the first.
I mean, honestly, I did not know what question you were going to ask when you were saying that you were listening to this interview, because I've been asked a lot of very wild questions in my very short career. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's something that I find often frustrating. I remember one of the first events I did for the Mothers, there was a white interview, and this is like before the book had come out. This was like months before. I think it was maybe the first public thing I ever did. And this white interviewer was like, well, what were you trying to say politically by not setting this book in the South? And I just remember I don't even remember what I said. I was so like confused and very nervous and everything. But afterwards, I just kept thinking like, well, Black people live everywhere, you know? Like, I grew up in Oceanside, which is a beach town in California, and to me, that was why I said it where I grew up. It wasn't because I was trying to make a larger point about that. And I think that's also when I think about someone like Terry McMillan, who did the same project, you know, 20, 30 years ago, which was writing about these professional Black women living in Phoenix and, you know, all of their sort of exploits and mishaps. And the idea that is subversive, again, that's what I was saying about timeliness. That is like an outward looking way of thinking about the book. Like, it's subversive from the standpoint of the presumed white audience who does not expect Black lives to play out in this way. It's not subversive for Black people who are living, you know, we're living our lives. There's nothing subversive about that, or even particularly interesting. It's just, again, that was the community that I came from, and that's why I set the book there. So, you know, I think it's something that I find frustrating, I think. And I think that was one of the reasons why I sort of hesitated a little bit when writing The Vanishing Half, because I think, honestly, if I can be very real, there was just a feeling I had of Oh my God, I had so many really dumb race questions about this book that was not even that explicitly about race. So why am I then writing more explicitly about race? I have a friend who said, it's like, the thing that you do best brings you closer to the things that you hate. And it was sort of that feeling like the better I write about race, the more I'm going to get questions about race that I hate. And it was that kind of thing that really did give me pause about doing what that interviewer was sort of pointing out that I didn't do with the first book, which was both writing a book set in the South about Black Americans and also writing more explicitly about race. So there was a part of me that felt resistant, I think, in the beginning because I didn't want to sort of, but then at the end of the day, again, I'm like, as a writer, I don't want to be looking outward in that way as I'm writing. I don't want to be writing in anticipation of what a white person is going to ask me about this book 5 years from now. I want to write to tell the story that I want to tell and what's exciting to me. And to me, colorism is a intra-community conversation. It's not a conversation that is really sort of welcoming in white people to ask what they think about it, or it's a conversation between and amongst Black people throughout the diaspora and people of color throughout the diaspora too. I've heard from a lot of South Asian readers who have also had experiences of navigating colorism and thinking about color in their communities. So it is such a conversation that I think involves people of color. And to me, that was the conversation that I wanted to enter, not one that involved me translating and explaining to white readers.
And this is the thing about good readers, that those conversations that can seem very specific catch on universally because readers seek out those stories. We don't read in our own comfort zones or in our own narrow identities, or at least we shouldn't.
Yes.
I kind of relate to this resistance because I wrote a novel about it set in the 19th century about a woman who had happened to be a slave, but that was her preface. It was a gothic novel. It was a love story. It was a murder mystery. And the one thing I said was, why are you falling into this cliche of being a Black woman writing a historical novel and having anything to do with slavery? And I really resisted it. I did it only because I thought I could say something new about it. But it did seem to me, and I've said this a lot, that there is this weight of expectation when you're a Black person setting out to write something, that it has to be serious, it has to be weighty, it has to tackle the topic of race, it has to be literary, it has to be prize-winning standard. How do you deal with that burden of expectation? I think you've probably answered it. You just write the books that come to you and the characters that come to you, but can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because I think everything that you're saying is very real. I think there's also another resistance I had about the Vanishing Half was just setting a book set in the past, because I feel like there is such comfort of thinking of Black stories as something that has existed in the past. But sort of the contemporary Black stories are what people are more resistant to supporting, like people will love Green Book, or they'll love 12 Years a Slave, or Selma, or something that is set. There's a way in which there's like a palette of consuming Black stories set in the past. But when you have stories that are just about, Black people in 2020 just living our lives and going through all of the sort of existential crises that come with being human, that's less interesting than somebody existing during the civil rights movement or someone existing during slavery, So there was a way in which I felt that resistance that you're describing. But I think for me, it's, a novel takes so much time and so much energy. And the idea of writing a novel in a way that's self-conscious, where I am either doing what I think people want me to do or not doing it, I think both of those impulses are equally bad. Like either writing directly into what I feel is expected of me, or writing an exact opposition of it because it's expected of me. I think both of those are things that I would feel like would be handcuffing me. And to me, the fun thing about writing a novel is really being in that space of freedom, being in that place where you can feel liberated from expectations, and you can feel liberated from what people want from you, and that you can think about what is exciting to you and what is playful and what is joyful. So to me, it was about chasing that feeling and trying to ignore what people liked about the mothers or what people didn't like about the mothers. I just didn't want to think about any of that. I wanted to write a book that would please me and that would excite me and that would challenge me. I wanted to write towards that expectation for myself more than any external expectation.
Spot on. When you were talking, I was thinking about writers like Raven Leilani and Brandon Taylor, who are completely tearing up the charts now with the kind of contemporary stories you're talking about. And we actually had a question from the public about anything you've read recently that you'd recommend. Maybe that ties into it, so I'll ask it now. Are there any authors or books exciting you at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I loved Raven Leilani's debut, Luster, which I was able to read like last December. I read it so early and had no one to talk to about. I was just kind of screaming into the void because no one I knew had read the book yet. But I think she's such an exciting writer. I think that, with the debut, I'm always just asking, do I want to read book 2 by this person? That is to me the most important thing about a debut. And with that book, I was like, yeah, I want to read book 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and whatever else she does. So that's a book that's exciting. Jessie just dropped her new book, Transcendent Kingdom, which is a contemporary set story. It's very different than her debut. And that book is really beautiful and moving. And Brian Washington's new book comes out, I think, this fall, Memorial, and I read an early copy of that book too, and it's like a very it's a breakup novel. It's a breakup novel, but it's not as depressing as that sounds, if that makes sense. And it's a book about this complex relationship between these two men. And one of the guys flies to visit his father in Japan, and his mother flies to Houston and is kind of stuck in this house with the boyfriend that he's slowly breaking up with. So it's truly it's a beautiful book, and yeah, those are 3 contemporary Black stories that I'm excited.
Brian Washington. I hadn't
Yes.
I hadn't heard about that one before, and it sounds marvelous. Maybe we should stick with questions from the public, because this is a really good one. I thought complex mother-daughter relationships are significant in the novel, but the fathers seem to be largely absent. Was that by design is the question? Were you consciously making a statement, or was that driven by the storyline?
I think driven by the story in a way. I think, my first book was about these sort of absent maternal figures. The mothers, there really are not mothers in that book. And this book was a little bit the opposite for me. There were sort of these kind of, in a way, I think, Early is a father figure. He's not Jude's biological father, but he becomes her father. But she has this fractured relationship with her biological father, and the twins have, their father has died. So yeah, I think for me, a lot of it was about wanting to write towards these really complex mother-daughter relationships, and this time in the way that those relationships were complex in the mothers, but also those mothers were absent. So wanting to write to them being present in this book in that way. And yeah, I think the characters also have these complicated relationships with their fathers that kind of emerge from that. But I think a lot of it was just me wanting to focus more on the relationships between mothers and daughters specifically, and thinking about how both of these daughters end up navigating these really choppy relationships with their mothers for very different reasons.
Yeah. The other thing about the novel is that it's joining a tradition of novels about passing, which I assume were among your influences. I'm thinking in particular of Nella Larson. That must be the one everyone's thinking about. But were there any that particularly influenced you? And also, were you conscious of trying to depart from them in significant ways as well?
Yeah, I think Larson was a big one. I think also the film adaptation of Imitation of Life was a big one for me. Just that was the first story I ever saw about passing when I was a kid watching that movie with my mom. So I was aware of a lot of these texts. And I think as far as departing from them, I wanted to mostly avoid punishing the passing character. I think that's what often happens. It's what happens in both of those texts, really. In Nella Larson, the character dies. And in Imitation of Life, her mother dies. So she is punished kind of as this prodigal daughter who's flinging herself on this casket and because she's killed her mother of a broken heart. So there's a sense of punishment at the end of both of those stories and a feeling that the character gets what she deserves for passing. And that's just something that's never quite sat right with me. I just think, I think it gives too much validity to whiteness to punish somebody for passing as white, I think. And aside from that, I think that it's also just boring to write a story that's that moralizing in the way that these stories were often so moralizing. So I was aware of some of the tropes and the conventions of that genre, but I also think that sometimes fiction is really interesting when you lean into those conventions and when you sort of, and I think as I was writing this book, I kept thinking about mythology and melodrama, and I think that those are two modes that fit well within passing stories, certainly melodrama because of their secrets and their, hidden families and their reveals and those types of things. And I think sometimes leaning into the conventions of a genre can be really fun. So that's why Kennedy eventually becomes a soap opera actress. And there are ways in which...
That's why I was smiling. I mean, you actually had this sort of melodrama right there. Yeah, exactly.
So I was just like, well, this is what it is. I'm not going to run from it. I'm going to embrace that, this is the forms and, secret
just
twins.
The reviewers accuse me of being melodramatic. I'm going to make sure you know it.
I think melodrama is really fun. I think that it gets a bad rap. I think it's a fun mode of storytelling, and I enjoy it. So
I wrote a gothic novel, and one of the reviewers, one of the only sort of slightly off reviews I got, said, "Oh, this was full of melodrama," and I was like, "Yes, that's
yes." Exactly. I think that when you see, I think someone seeing what something is and leaning into it can be a really fun and generative way to tell a story. So I enjoy melodrama. I do.
Yeah. Okay, so more questions from your fans. Let's talk about the film adaptation, because that must be very exciting. I think daunting for an author as well. Is it the first time you've handed your work over to be manipulated by someone else? And the question from the public is, do you have any fear that this will alter your own image of your characters?
Ooh, that's a daunting question. No, I don't. I mean, it's so early right now. We're still talking to writers and so kind of assembling the creative team around the project. So it's too early, I think, for me to have any specific anxieties. I think that my only fear for the project would be that it gets flattened somehow, that it loses the nuance of the book as it enters television, which is a different medium. But I think that the encouraging thing for me is that I feel that, the team at HBO, I think that they see the book in the way that I see the book. And I think that the people that we've been talking to sort of assemble around us see the book in a similar way. And that's the thing that I think is most important for me, is just keeping nuance and keeping beauty and having this be something that is, beautiful and entertaining, but also beautiful. So I'm encouraged that we have a good team around us and that we're bringing in really brilliant writers to take over and translate this book and turn it into a different experience, a new experience, hopefully, for the reader.
I'm really excited to see it, but I have to say, when I was thinking about the fact that this will be adapted, I felt sorry for the casting director who has to find twins who can pass but also can age. Good luck.
I agree. I think that casting this is going to be tricky, but I think that the good thing is that, so many people want to work with HBO. It's less about me and more about the pull that they have, where they can get
partly about you, Brit.
I mean, I'm just like, they got like Meryl Streep to be on Big Little Lies. I'm like, these people can do anything. So yeah, so I
fighting. Meryl Streep will probably say, "Oh, sure, I can say it to you."
We'll find something for her to do in the book. We'll write her apart.
She can be the mother-in-law. She can be just Brad's
Yes.
mother. Yeah.
Yes,
we've got to get Meryl Streep involved.
That is a great suggestion. We need like a big scene with the mother-in-law. Yes.
Another question from the public. What non-political leader in the US today is best positioned to influence positive movement to unite the country? Non-political. So I assume we can't talk about Kamala.
I mean, honestly, I don't know that the country will be united. I don't know that it can be united. And I also don't know that that's even the goal or if that's inherently good. I mean, I keep thinking about this. I did an event with Michael Denzel Smith, and he was talking about the idea that the American flag, for example, is supposed to contain the military and the police and the protesters who are saying that the police should not kill people with impunity. It's supposed to contain all of those people and all of those ideas. And is that possible? The idea that you have some people who are saying we should be able to kill anybody with impunity, and you have some people who are saying we shouldn't, and all of those are swept up in the same sort of imagery and the same national identity. So I don't know. I don't know that it seems to me that this country is going to continue to fracture. I think regardless of who wins the election, the country will continue to fracture. And I don't know. I don't really have any expectation that is going to change anytime soon. I think if anything, even if Trump loses, it's in a lot of ways that sort of fringe, not even fringe, it's the second, the most powerful political party in the country right now. But the right wing, I think they will be emboldened if he loses. I don't think these people are going to retreat. I think even if Joe Biden wins, they're going to still be sticking around. So I have no expectation for that. Sorry.
I think even on the other side of the Atlantic where I live, we're realizing or reminding ourselves that the fractures are always there. It's just sometimes the people on the other side of the divide are more quiet than other times. We're hearing each other now, but we're just articulating feelings that they've had and have never lost. This is an interesting one. Did you identify more strongly with Desiree or Stella while you were writing the book? I mean, I think the answer must be that you've identified with both of them in some way, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
Creations.
I think so. I identified with both of them, but I think personality-wise, I'm definitely closer to Stella. I mean, I think for better or worse, when I'm writing, who's the character that people hate a little bit, that's usually the character who's mostly me. I'm never like, some books you read and you're like, oh, the like hero is the stand-in for the writer. That's never the case. So the mothers, I was definitely Nadia, and like with this book, I was definitely more Stella. I think I'm definitely more guarded. I'm more introverted. I'm sort of have that sort of bit, and I have that restlessness and that feeling that idea of just moving away where nobody knows you. Like that's a fantasy I frequently entertain. So that to me is more, I think, me than Desiree, who's somebody who is in a lot of ways a lot more loyal, and she kind of stays and takes care of her mother. I would love to be like, that is me, that is what I would do. But I do think that I have that kind of selfish streak and that self-preservation that Stella pursues at all costs. So maybe, unfortunately, probably a little bit more Stella, but I think, yeah, whatever's the character that people hate a little bit, that's usually me in the book. That's how you know.
Hooray for the female anti-heroine. I couldn't agree more. Those are my favorite. The bad woman in books are always the ones I feel drawn to as well. Do you have some favorite bad female characters?
I mean, I hate to say it, but I think one of the first I read was like Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, who's just a monster. Like she's a brat. And I remember reading that book as a child and just being shocked because I always heard this sort of mythology surrounding this book and this movie. Like this was some great American classic. And not to, it feels weird to say slavery aside. Obviously, that's a big, important way in which you're reading the book, but just like thinking about the personalities of these characters, I kept thinking like, I don't know that I had read a lot of books at that time where there was somebody who was particularly a woman who was just a nightmare and she is the main character, that she was the person we were supposed to identify with, who was just like the scheming, selfish brat. And yet is also somebody who, has that self-preservation, she's somebody who is going to find a way. So I remember that being a character that I was just like, I didn't know you could do that. When I was reading, I don't know that I had seen a lot of women like that in literature. And I remember really being drawn to that. And of course, somebody like Sula, who, is this, I guess maybe an anti-heroine, I would say. Yeah, is this character who, again, has that, that pursuit of freedom at all costs. I think I really love any female character, well, not any, but I love a lot of female characters that will do, who will be unlikable, who will be selfish, who will put themselves first. I love rooting for those types of characters. So
and I think more people like those kinds of women than admit they do. I'm thinking of the way Fleabag caught on.
Yes.
Chewing Gum, which I think is one of the best TV series of all time.
Yes.
I May Destroy You, and even better if that's possible. We're tapping into this notion of moving away from our perfect expectations and telling the truth, embracing messiness and selfishness.
I think so too, and I especially love that in I May Destroy You, because you have this person who has experienced this really heinous thing. And again, it would be so easy to paint this character as just this very flattened victim who has, experienced something really horrible, and that is sort of the flat way in which you see her. But instead, we see the ways in which she's becomes like this horrible friend, and the ways in which she treats these other people in her life. The show is so unscathing about that, and as we see this character, I thought Michaela Coel's a genius. We all know that, but I thought it was so brilliant, and I love Chewing Gum. I thought the show was brilliant, but I love exactly what you're saying. A character who can just be messy and complicated in the way that we all are.
Yeah. Some of us have known she was a genius for a long time, and then others are just now
figuring out. Yes.
This is a weird question. I'm going to ask it. It's from the public, not from me. This is one of those questions but I think it's an interesting one.
Okay.
So I'm just going to read it. It's come in as it's come in. I have a friend who's light-skinned and married a white woman. His son easily passes as white, but not on purpose, except where law enforcement is concerned. His father approves. Your opinion? Damn question, like 500 words.
Yeah. I have no opinion. I don't know these people. I have no opinion.
That's what I thought you might say. But we could sort of segue into passing generally in the modern context. I don't know whether you did any research or spoke to anyone, or, are these stories out there? Do people still, and I ask you this knowing that there are members of my family who I presume are passing all over the world as well. But do people still make an issue of this? Do people still come out as having passed as white?
I don't know. I didn't do as much contemporary reading about it, to be honest. But I did read books that were set in the past about people who passed. And to me, the really interesting thing was the unknowability about it, which is what you just said. Like the idea that if this is something that you have done correctly or you've gotten away with, if you've done it successfully, then nobody will ever know that you did it. And that's the nature of passing. So there's no way we cannot have a correct tally of all the people who have passed. There will be no accounting for it in a way unless somebody reveals this about themselves. In a way, it's sort of like faking your death, where if you have someone who has successfully faked your death, then no one will know that you've done it. And if you get caught, then that means that you did something wrong. So to me, there was something so interesting about the mystery of it. And I think just the complexity of it. I think the idea of somebody like Stella, who has kind of the most extreme version where she completely cuts off all of her family and sort of reinvents herself and slams that door to her past shut. And there are other people who are passing from moment to moment, or moments where it's advantageous, or moments, there are people who are passing and they don't know it, that their red is something else. I remember being in a Spanish class and having the professor assume that I was Dominican. And it was like halfway through the class where he was like, well, you're Dominican, right? And that was a moment where I was just like, this whole class, this is what this person thought about my, ethnicity, and I just had no idea. So, there are all of these ways in which I think passing is really complex. But for me, and to sort of loop back into that question, the least interesting way to me was, again, making any type of moral judgment about it. I truly did not want to write this book in the way of, was Stella wrong or right to pass? That was the most boring way to think about it, I think. To me, what was really most interesting was thinking about the effects of her passing on her life, on her family, the ways in which this changes her, the ways in which her conception of herself changes over time as she gets deeper and deeper into this new world.
And you did it so marvelously, so triumphantly. Are you working on something new?
I am working on something new. It's a new novel, and it's about two singers who have a lifelong feud.
Perfect. I am
yes.
there. I'm in line. It's been
fun.
Such a joy to talk to you about this one. I'm so excited to see the adaptation and to read the new novel when it comes. And huge congratulations on everything, Brit. You thoroughly deserve it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.